This story is titled, Jobless Ex-Fiancée Returned for Her Stuff. I opened her suitcase and told her the truth. Hey everyone! We're so close to hitting 25,000 subscribers. Let's make it happen together before the new year. Hit that subscribe button and be part of this amazing journey with me. Let's do this. Now let's start the video. OP starts by saying, I'm 34, and about a month ago, my fiancé, who's 33, ended our 9-year relationship. 9 years, just gone. She didn't do it with a fight or even a big conversation. No, she sat me down one evening and said, I don't love you anymore. That was it. No warning, no buildup. She didn't seem upset or conflicted about it either. It was like she'd already moved on in her head, and I was just catching up. I asked her if I'd done something wrong. Maybe I'd missed something, some sign she was unhappy, or a problem she wanted to talk about. But she just shook her head and said, No, you didn't do anything wrong. I've just fallen out of love. I don't think I've ever felt more blindsided in my life. It's not like I thought we had the perfect relationship, but we were solid, or so I thought. I loved her, and I genuinely believed we were building a life together. I supported her in everything, even when she decided she didn't want to work anymore. For 7 years, I was happy to take care of her, because I loved her and thought we were a team. But apparently, she didn't see it that way. I sat there in shock, trying to process what she'd just said. She seemed so calm, like this was no big deal. Meanwhile, my head was spinning. I asked her if this was really what she wanted, if there was anything I could do to fix things. She just nodded and said, Yes, this is what I want. At that point, I realized there was nothing more to say. I wasn't going to beg her to stay if she didn't want to be with me. So, I told her to pack some clothes and stay at her sister's for a while. I needed time to think, and I couldn't do that with her in the house. She wasn't happy about that. She asked why she had to leave, saying it was her home too. I reminded her that she was the one breaking things off, not me. I also asked for her house key, which really seemed to annoy her, but she handed it over after a bit of back and forth. Watching her pack her things and leave was surreal. 9 years together, and she was gone in less than an hour. That night, I just sat in the living room, staring at the walls. The house felt so empty, but at the same time, it was full of reminders of her. Her clothes were still in the closet, her makeup was still in the bathroom, and the little decorations she insisted on buying were everywhere. It felt like she'd left a piece of herself behind in every room. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept replaying the conversation in my head, trying to figure out what went wrong. I'd given her everything, love, support, stability, and it still wasn't enough. The next morning, I woke up to a house that felt way too big for one person. I knew I had to start figuring out what to do next, but I couldn't bring myself to do anything just yet. I wasn't ready. The day after the breakup, I woke up to a quiet, empty house. It was suffocating. Everywhere I looked, there were reminders of her. The closet full of her clothes, the random knickknacks she loved decorating with, even the mug she always used for her morning coffee. It was like she was still there, even though she wasn't. That same afternoon, she called. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. Maybe she'd had second thoughts? Maybe she wanted to talk things out? Hey, she said, as casual as if nothing had happened. I kept my tone neutral. What's up? E.T. I just wanted to check in, she said, like this was any ordinary day. I was stunned. Check in? We'd been together for 9 years and she ended it just yesterday. What was there to check in on? So, I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. You're really sure about this? Yeah, she said, without hesitation. This is what I want. I felt a lump in my throat but forced it down. Okay, I said. If that's the case, I need to start making some changes. What kind of changes? She asked, her tone still infuriatingly casual. I explained that I'd be removing her from the car insurance, canceling her phone plan, and cutting off her access to the joint bank account. It wasn't out of spite, it was just practical. What? Why would you do that? She asked, suddenly defensive. Because we're not together anymore, I replied. Why would I keep paying for those things when you've decided to end the relationship? She accused me of being petty, of trying to punish her for breaking up with me. Her words stung, but I stood my ground. It's not petty, I said. It's reality. You can't expect me to keep taking care of you like I did when we were together. That's not how this works. She didn't take it well. She kept saying I was being unfair, that I was leaving her with nothing. I reminded her that this was her decision, not mine. She chose to leave, and these were the consequences. Over the next few days, I started putting things into motion. First, I called the insurance company and removed her from the policy for the car I owned. Then, I canceled her phone plan. She hadn't been paying for it anyway. It was under my account. Finally, I went to the bank and closed the joint account she had access to. Each step felt like I was taking back a piece of myself. It wasn't about punishing her. It was about reclaiming my life. Of course, she didn't see it that way. She sent me a flurry of texts accusing me of being vindictive and heartless. She said I was making her life harder than it needed to be. "You're making me start from scratch," one message read. "I don't have anything now. How is that fair?" I didn't respond. What could I say? She was acting like I owed her something, like it was my job to make sure she was okay, even after she'd left me. Through mutual friends, I found out she was staying with her sister and struggling to adjust to her new reality. She hadn't worked in 7 years, so she had no recent experience to put on a resume. Apparently, she'd applied to a few places, but no one called her back. One night, she called me again, this time asking if I'd let her keep the car, just until I get back on my feet. "Absolutely not," I said. "Why not?" "You have another car," she snapped. "Because it's mine," I replied. "I paid for it, and I need it." "You're being so cruel," she said, her voice trembling. "You're leaving me with nothing. I thought you cared about me." "I did care," I said, trying to stay calm. "I cared for 9 years. I took care of you, supported you, and gave you everything you needed. But you made the decision to end that. You can't expect me to keep taking care of you when we're not together anymore." She hung up on me. By the end of the week, I'd cut all the strings. The car was mine again, the phone plan was canceled, and the joint account was closed. For the first time in years, I felt like I was in control of my life. It wasn't easy. Part of me still cared about her and wanted to make sure she was okay. But every time I started to feel guilty, I reminded myself of the truth. She chose this. She ended things, not me. That realization helped me stay strong. I wasn't being petty or vindictive. I was just moving on. About a week after the breakup, she texted me again, saying she needed to come by and pick up the rest of her things. I figured it was best to just let her get it over with, so I agreed. Honestly, I didn't want her stuff sitting around the house any longer than it had to. She showed up the next evening carrying a suitcase. She barely said hello as she walked past me into the house, heading straight to the bedroom. I stayed in the living room, trying to give her space, but I could hear her rummaging around. Drawers opening and closing, hangers clattering, every sound grated on my nerves. After a while, she came into the living room holding my laptop. "What are you doing with that?" I asked, already feeling the tension rising. "I'm taking it," she said matter-of-factly. "I use it all the time anyway." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "No, you're not," I said firmly. "That's mine. I paid for it. Just because you used it sometimes doesn't make it yours." She gave me this exasperated look, like I was being unreasonable. "Are you serious right now? After everything, you're going to argue over a laptop?" "Yeah, I am," I replied. "Because it's mine." Her expression shifted from annoyed to angry. "Wow, petty much?" she snapped, clutching the laptop tighter. That's when I decided to check her suitcase. Something about the way she was acting made me suspicious. "What are you doing?" she asked, stepping in front of me as I reached for the suitcase. "I'm looking," I said, brushing past her and unzipping it. Sure enough, it was full of things that didn't belong to her. My headphones, a set of kitchen knives I'd bought last year, even a hoodie she always borrowed but never asked to take. I started pulling the items out one by one. "Care to explain this?" I asked, holding up the headphones. She crossed her arms and glared at me. "I use those all the time. You never even noticed." "That doesn't make them yours," I shot back. "Just because you use something doesn't mean you get to take it when you leave." She started yelling, accusing me of being cruel and petty, of trying to make her life harder. "It's just a few things. You don't even need them." "That's not the point," I said, trying to stay calm. "The point is, they're not yours to take." At that point, I'd had enough. "You can take your clothes, your makeup, and your personal stuff, but everything else in this house? It's mine. You didn't work for it, and you don't get to just walk away with whatever you want." Her face crumpled and she started crying. "I can't believe how heartless you're being," she sobbed. I stood firm. "I'm not being heartless. I'm just not letting you take things that don't belong to you." She kept crying, saying I was punishing her, that I was trying to make her miserable. But I didn't back down. Finally, I told her, "You've got everything you came for. It's time for you to leave." That night, she sent me a long, rambling text. It was full of the same accusations. I was being unfair. I was making her life impossible. I was punishing her for breaking up with me. I didn't bother responding. At this point, it felt like no matter what I said, she would twist it into something else to paint herself as the victim. Over the next few days, I started going through the house and packing up the rest of her stuff. There wasn't much left. Just a few odds and ends she hadn't bothered to take. I put everything into a box and left it in the corner of the garage. I considered texting her to come pick it up, but honestly, I didn't want to deal with her anymore. If she wanted it, she could ask for it. I wasn't going to chase her down to return her things. Mutual friends started reaching out, saying she'd been complaining about me to anyone who would listen. According to her, I was this bitter, vindictive ex who was doing everything in my power to make her life miserable. It was frustrating, but I didn't let it bother me too much. People could believe whatever they wanted. I knew the truth, and that was enough for me. By the end of the week, I felt like I'd finally taken back control of my space. The house was mine again, free of her stuff and her presence. It still felt a little empty, but for the first time, I felt like I could start moving on. A few days after the fight over her suitcase, I thought things might finally quiet down. I had packed the rest of her stuff into a box and was ready to move forward. But of course, she wasn't done. She called me late one evening, and against my better judgment, I picked up. I figured maybe she wanted to arrange to pick up the box or apologize for the argument. Instead, she sounded desperate, almost panicked. "I need help," she said, her voice shaky. I stayed silent for a moment, unsure of what to say. "What kind of help?" I asked cautiously. "I can't find a job," she said, her voice breaking. "It's been so long, and no one's calling me back. I've tried, but it's like, I don't even know where to start." I sighed, leaning back in my chair. "I'm sorry to hear that, but I don't know what you want me to do about it." Her tone shifted, becoming sharper. "You could help me, for starters. I gave up my career for you. The least you could do is help me get back on my feet." That line hit a nerve. "You didn't give up your career for me," I said, keeping my voice steady. "You chose to stop working because you didn't want to anymore. I supported you because I loved you. But don't act like I forced you to quit." She started crying then, telling me how hard everything was, and how much she was struggling. She said her sister was getting tired of her being there, and was pressuring her to find a job. "I have nothing right now," she said through sobs. "I'm sleeping on a couch, I have no money, and I don't even know how to pay for groceries. How is that fair?" I paused, choosing my words carefully. "I'm sorry you're in this situation, but this isn't on me. You ended the relationship, and with that, you ended the financial support that came with it. I can't keep taking care of you when we're not together." Her tone turned angry. "Wow, so that's it? 9 years together, and you're just going to leave me to suffer?" "You made this choice," I said firmly. "Not me." She hung up without another word. Over the next week, the texts started pouring in again. At first, they were emotional, filled with regret and apologies. She said she missed me, that she had made a mistake, that she was struggling to adjust to life without me. But when I didn't respond, her tone shifted. The messages became bitter, accusatory. She called me heartless, selfish, and even cruel. She said I was punishing her for the breakup and ruining her life. It was hard to read, but I forced myself to stay firm. I knew if I caved now, it would never stop. Through mutual friends, I started hearing more about how she was doing. Apparently, her sister had given her an ultimatum: find a job within a month or move out. She was applying everywhere she could think of, but no one was calling her back. After 7 years out of the workforce, she didn't have much to put on a resume. A friend told me she had broken down at a group hangout, crying about how she'd ruined her life and wished she could go back to how things were before. I didn't feel bad for her, though. She had everything: stability, love, and a comfortable life, and she threw it away. One evening, I was at home when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I hesitated before opening it. When I did, there she was, standing on my porch. She looked terrible. Her hair was a mess, her eyes were red and puffy, and she was wearing clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in days. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my tone flat. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice trembling. I stepped aside and let her in, more out of curiosity than anything else. She sat down on the couch, her hands shaking as she tried to compose herself. "I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice breaking. "I've tried, but I can't. I can't find a job. I can't afford to live like this. I don't know what to do." I waited, giving her a chance to continue. "I made a mistake," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I thought I could handle this on my own, but I can't. I miss you. I miss us. I still love you." Her words hung in the air, but instead of feeling sympathy or longing, I just felt numb. "You don't love me," I said finally. "You loved the life I gave you. That's not the same thing." She shook her head, insisting that she meant it, that she wanted to fix things and come back. "I can't help you," I said, standing up. "You made your choice, and now you have to live with it." She begged me to reconsider, saying she'd do whatever it took to make things right, but I wasn't interested. I had given her everything for 9 years, and it still wasn't enough. I wasn't going to give her a second chance to take advantage of me. "It's time for you to leave," I said, opening the door. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes pleading, but when she saw I wasn't changing my mind, she got up and walked out. As the door closed behind her, I felt a wave of relief. For the first time since the breakup, I felt like I had truly closed the door, both literally and figuratively, on that chapter of my life. After that final confrontation, I knew it was over for good. She had begged, cried, and made every excuse in the book, but none of it changed what I knew deep down. She didn't miss me. She missed the life I gave her. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. No more guilt. No more second-guessing myself. I wasn't responsible for her anymore, and it felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. A few days later, I got a text from a mutual friend. Apparently, her sister had finally kicked her out. She'd missed her deadline to find a job and had been refusing to contribute financially, so her sister gave her no choice but to leave. I wasn't sure where she went after that, and honestly, I didn't want to know. I heard she had managed to find a part-time job at a local cafe. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep her afloat. Barely. She was staying in a tiny apartment, scraping by with what little she had. Mutual friends told me she was miserable, constantly complaining about how hard life was and how unfair everything had been. But here's the thing. I didn't feel bad for her. She made her choices. She decided to leave me, and she had to live with the consequences. Around that same time, I started seeing someone new. Her name's Natalie, and she's everything my ex wasn't. We met through a mutual friend, and at first, I wasn't sure if I was ready to date again. But Natalie changed that. She's smart, independent, and hardworking. She has a great career as a project manager and her own place. She doesn't need me to take care of her. She's perfectly capable of standing on her own 2 feet. Being with her felt refreshing. For the first time in years, I was in a relationship where both people contributed equally. When I told her about my breakup, she was shocked at how much I'd done for my ex and how little I'd gotten in return. "You deserve better than that," she said. And for the first time, I actually believed it. One evening, while Natalie and I were having dinner, I got a notification on my phone. It was a message from my ex. She'd found a way to contact me through a new number. The message was long, emotional, and filled with regret. She said she couldn't find stable work, that she was barely making ends meet, and that she'd made a mistake leaving me. She ended the message by asking if I would consider letting her move back in, just until I get back on my feet. I showed the message to Natalie, who raised an eyebrow. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "Nothing," I said. "I'm not even going to respond." And I didn't. A few days later, my ex showed up at my house unannounced. Natalie was there with me when the doorbell rang. I opened the door, and there she was, looking even more disheveled than the last time I'd seen her. "I need to talk to you," she said, glancing at Natalie with thinly veiled irritation. "There's nothing to talk about," I said, keeping my voice calm. She started crying, launching into the same story I'd already heard. She was struggling. She had nowhere to go. She'd made a mistake. She begged me to let her move back in, saying she'd do whatever it took to fix things. But I wasn't having it. "You don't love me," I told her. "You love the life I gave you. That's not the same thing." She kept crying, insisting that she meant it, that she wanted to make things right, but I'd heard it all before. "I'm sorry you're struggling," I said, "but I'm not your safety net anymore. You made your choice, and you have to live with it. You don't get to come back just because things didn't work out the way you thought they would." She looked at me like she couldn't believe what I was saying, but I didn't care. I'd spent too long trying to take care of someone who never appreciated it. "It's time for you to leave," I said, stepping aside and holding the door open. She hesitated, her eyes darting between me and Natalie. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away. After the door closed, Natalie looked at me and smiled. "I'm proud of you," she said. And you know what? I was proud of myself too. For the first time in years, I was finally putting myself first. Now I'm focusing on my future with Natalie. She's been an incredible source of support, and she's helped me see my worth in a way I hadn't before. I'm happier now than I've been in years, and I'm excited about what's ahead. As for my ex, I don't know what happened to her after that night, and I don't care. She made her choices, and I made mine. And for the first time, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Final update. A few months after our final conversation, I had almost forgotten about my ex. Life with Natalie was going great. We were traveling, making plans for the future, and just enjoying a healthy, balanced relationship. I wasn't keeping tabs on my ex, but then, one day, a mutual friend called me out of nowhere with some news. "You're not going to believe what happened," they started, almost laughing. Apparently, my ex had started dating someone new shortly after we broke up. This guy, let's call him Ethan, was flashy. Designer clothes, expensive cars, and constant Instagram posts of him living it up at fancy restaurants and resorts. She must have thought she hit the jackpot. Another guy who could give her the kind of life I had provided, maybe even better. Except Ethan wasn't who he claimed to be. At first, everything seemed perfect. He was showering her with gifts, taking her to high-end parties, and introducing her to what she probably thought was an elite circle of friends. She was living in what she called a dream. But here's the catch. Ethan was broke. The cars, leased. The parties, paid for on credit. The friends, a sketchy group of wannabe influencers and hustlers. Turns out, Ethan was running on borrowed time and borrowed money, and my ex had no clue. From what I heard, Ethan started asking her to help him out financially. It started small, covering a dinner here, paying for gas there, but then it escalated. He convinced her to open a credit card in her name, saying it would help them build a future together. She fell for it. It didn't take long for things to go downhill. Ethan's friends started coming around more often, borrowing money, crashing on her couch, and treating her place like a flophouse. She tried to keep up with their expensive lifestyle, probably thinking it would pay off in the long run. But the debts kept piling up, and Ethan started disappearing for days at a time. One day he left and didn't come back. He ghosted her completely, leaving her with maxed out credit cards, unpaid bills, and some very angry people knocking on her door. Turns out, those friends weren't just freeloaders. They were the kind of people who loan you money with strings attached. Big strings. A mutual friend who had stayed in touch with her told me what happened next. Apparently, a couple of these shady characters showed up at her apartment one evening, demanding repayment for some loans Ethan had taken out. She tried to explain that she didn't know anything about it, but they weren't buying it. They threatened her, told her that if she didn't pay up, there would be consequences. She panicked, of course, but what could she do? She didn't have the money. She tried calling Ethan, but his number was disconnected. She even went to his last known address, only to find out he'd skipped town. She was left to deal with the mess on her own. When I heard about all of this, I won't lie, I felt a mix of emotions. Part of me felt bad for her. No one deserves to be scammed or put in a dangerous situation. But another part of me couldn't help but think, this is what happens when you take people for granted. She wanted someone to give her an easy life, to take care of her so she wouldn't have to work or worry about anything. And instead, she ended up with someone who used her, just like she had used me. But the karma didn't stop there. With no way to pay off her debts, she was forced to sell most of her belongings. The designer bags and clothes she'd once flaunted were pawned off for pennies compared to what they were worth. She ended up moving into a tiny, run-down apartment in a bad part of town because it was all she could afford. She tried to pick up extra shifts at the cafe where she worked, but her boss wasn't willing to give her more hours. She started looking for a second job, but after so many years of not working, her resume was too weak. I even heard she tried reaching out to her family for help, but they weren't in a position to do much for her. Her sister, the one who had let her crash on the couch, had finally cut ties, saying she couldn't deal with the constant drama anymore. The final straw? She ended up getting sued by the credit card company for the debt Ethan left her with. She tried to argue that it wasn't her fault, but her name was on the account, so legally it all fell on her. From what I heard, she's now working with some debt relief program, scraping together what little she can to pay off what she owes. Meanwhile, I was thriving. Natalie and I were growing closer every day, and I was finally able to focus on my own goals without someone else's baggage holding me back. I didn't feel the need to keep tabs on my ex anymore, but the occasional updates from mutual friends reminded me of how far I'd come. She had made her choices, and now she was dealing with the fallout. Karma, as they say, doesn't miss.